The Vex Empire conquered 1,000 planets. Their armor could stop nuclear missiles. Their ships were faster than light. They came to Earth expecting a quick victory. But they made one fatal mistake. They didn't know that a mechanic named Bob was about to run out of tissues. It started as a very normal Tuesday morning. The sun was shining brightly over the city, and people were busy rushing to their jobs. Traffic filled the streets, and the coffee shops were full of customers. Nobody looked at the sky until the shadows appeared. Suddenly, the blue sky disappeared. Giant silver shapes moved silently through the clouds. These were not clouds, and they were not airplanes. They were massive spaceships. The ships were perfectly round and smooth, shining like polished mirrors. They covered the sun, and the entire city fell into a strange, dark shadow. The birds stopped singing, and the cars stopped moving. The world became very quiet. Inside the biggest ship, the Vex watched the Earth below. The Vex were a species obsessed with cleanliness and perfection. They traveled across the galaxy looking for planets to fix. To them, Earth was a dirty and messy place. They did not see humans as people, they saw them as germs that needed to be cleaned. A signal went out from the lead ship. Instantly, every television, computer, and smartphone on Earth turned black. A symbol appeared on the screens. It was a perfect white circle. A voice spoke from every device at the same time. The voice was cold and lacked any emotion. It told the humans that their time was over. It said the Vex had arrived to bring order to the chaos. They warned the humans not to fight, because resistance was useless. High above the panic on the streets, a man named Bob was having a terrible day. Bob was not a soldier or a scientist. He was an air conditioning mechanic. He was standing on the roof of a 20-story building, wrestling with a broken cooling unit. Bob did not care about the shiny ships or the scary message. His biggest problem was his nose. Bob had a very bad cold. His head felt heavy, his throat was sore, and his nose was running like a leaking faucet. He had a box of tissues in his tool belt, and his pockets were full of used, crumpled paper. Bob wiped his red, itchy nose with his greasy sleeve. He heard the sirens below and saw the shadow cover the roof, but he just wanted to finish his job so he could go home and sleep. His phone buzzed in his pocket with the alien message, but he ignored it. He was trying to tighten a rusty bolt. Finally, he looked up. He saw the main alien ship descending slowly. It was beautiful and terrifying. The metal was so clean it looked like liquid silver. It was huge, blocking out the entire horizon. The ship was heading straight for the Central Park, which was right next to Bob's building. The wind from the giant engine blew dust into Bob's face. He blinked his watery eyes. The ship was landing only a few hundred meters away from him. He was the closest human to the landing zone. While the rest of the world hid in basements or ran away in fear, Bob stood there with his wrench in one hand and a tissue in the other. He sniffed loudly. The Vex thought they were landing to conquer a weak planet. They did not know that the most dangerous thing on Earth was standing on a roof nearby, fighting the urge to sneeze. The massive silver ship settled onto the grass of the city park with a soft hum. It did not make a loud crash or create smoke. It was terrifyingly perfect. The landing gear touched the ground gently, like a feather falling on a pillow. A moment later, a seamless door opened on the side of the ship. A long, white ramp extended down to the ground. The ramp was so clean it looked like it belonged in a high-tech hospital, not a battlefield. From the darkness of the ship, the Vex soldiers marched out. They moved in perfect synchronization. Their armor was pure white, without a single scratch or spot of dirt. They held weapons that glowed with a soft blue light, looking less like guns and more like advanced sterilization tools. They formed a perfect line, facing the frightened crowd of humans who had gathered at the edge of the park. Then, the Supreme Commander emerged. He was taller than the other soldiers and wore a cape that shimmered like oil on water. He walked with total confidence. To him, the Earth was not a planet of warriors, it was just a dirty room that needed to be scrubbed. He looked at the humans cowering behind police cars and park benches. He felt nothing but disgust. The Vex prized cleanliness above all else. They had evolved in a sterile environment where germs did not exist. They believed that any biological imperfection was a sin. The commander stopped at the bottom of the ramp and looked up at the buildings surrounding the park. He saw the rust, the graffiti, and the pollution. He shook his head in disappointment. The commander wanted to make a statement. He wanted these primitive creatures to see the face of their new master. He looked at the readings on his wrist computer. The screen showed that the Earth's air was filled with pollutants and bacteria, but it was breathable for a short time. He decided to take the risk. He wanted to smell his victory. With a sharp hissing sound, the commander unlocked his helmet. He lifted it off his head. Underneath, his face was pale and smooth. He had no hair, no eyebrows, and his skin looked like soft plastic. He looked elegant, but also very fragile. He took a deep breath of the city air and curled his lip in disgust. It smelled of exhaust fumes and cheap food. High above the park, on the edge of the roof, Bob was watching everything. He was hiding behind a large metal vent, trying to stay invisible. He knew he should run away, but his legs felt heavy from his sickness. The landing of the giant ship had kicked up a lot of dust and pollen from the park trees. The wind carried this cloud of dust straight up the side of the building. It swirled around Bob's face. Bob felt a familiar and terrible sensation. His nose began to tickle. It started as a small itch, deep inside his nostrils. He tried to ignore it, but the dust made it worse. Bob panicked. He knew that if he made a noise, the aliens might look up and see him. He dropped his wrench and used both hands to pinch his nose shut. His eyes began to water uncontrollably. His face turned red as he held his breath. The pressure in his head started to build. It felt like a balloon inflating inside his skull. The commander down below was preparing to speak, waiting for total silence. The world was quiet, waiting for the aliens' first words. But on the roof, the battle was not against aliens, it was against a sneeze. The tickle grew stronger and sharper. Bob's chest tightened. He gasped for air silently, his mouth opening against his will. The dust danced in front of his face, teasing him. The sneeze was coming, and there was absolutely nothing Bob could do to stop it. The Vex Supreme Commander stood tall on the green grass of the park. He looked like a statue made of ice and silver. He tapped a small device on his collar, and his voice boomed across the city. It was loud, deep, and terrifying. He began his speech to the trembling humans. He told them that their civilization was a mistake. He called them dirty biological errors that needed to be corrected. To the commander, this was not a war. It was a cleaning job. He spoke about the glory of the Vex and their mission to bring total perfection to the universe. The humans below listened in terrified silence. They felt small and helpless against this advanced technology. The commander enjoyed their fear. He smiled a cold, thin smile. He felt completely safe breathing the earth air, believing his superior body could handle a little dirt. High above this dramatic scene, Bob was fighting a losing battle. The urge to sneeze had become painful. It felt like a tiny feather was spinning rapidly inside his nose. He pressed his fingers against his nostrils so hard that his knuckles turned white. His face was no longer just red, it was turning a shade of purple from holding his breath. Tears streamed down his cheeks, blurring his vision. He was not crying because he was scared of the aliens. He was crying because the pressure in his head was unbearable. He tried to distract himself. He tried to think about dry things. He thought about deserts, sandpaper, and toast. But the wind kept blowing the dust and pollen from the park right into his face. His body wanted to expel the germs, but his brain screamed at him to stop. Down in the street, the tension was thick enough to cut with a knife. Parents held their children tight, covering their eyes. Police officers lowered their guns, realizing their bullets would simply bounce off the shiny white armor of the aliens. The Vex soldiers stood completely still, waiting for the order to begin the cleansing. The commander paused his speech. He wanted the silence to stretch out. He wanted the humans to really feel the weight of their doom. The city was quieter than it had ever been. There were no honking cars, no sirens, and no talking. The only sound was the gentle wind rustling the leaves of the trees. It was the perfect moment for the commander to declare his final victory. Then, the silence was broken. It was a small, gasping sound at first. On the roof, Bob's willpower finally snapped. His lungs pulled in air greedily. His chest expanded like a barrel. He threw his head back helplessly. The hand pinching his nose slipped off because of the sweat. The sneeze was no longer just a tickle, it was a biological explosion waiting to happen. He tried to stifle it, but it was too late. A loud, desperate gasping sound escaped his throat. Ah! Heh! The sound echoed off the metal vent and drifted down toward the park below. It sounded strange and unnatural in the quiet air. The Vex Supreme Commander stopped speaking mid-sentence. He frowned, looking confused. He heard the strange noise coming from above. It sounded like a weapon charging up, or perhaps a wild beast. He tilted his smooth, pale head upward. He looked directly at the roof of the building where Bob was standing. The Vex soldiers also looked up, raising their glowing blue weapons. The humans in the crowd looked up too. Thousands of eyes were focused on the edge of that roof. They saw a small, lonely figure leaning over the edge. Bob was shaking violently. His mouth was wide open. His eyes were shut tight. He looked like he was about to shout a war cry, but biology was about to take over. The sneeze hung in the air for a split second, suspended in time, ready to change the course of history. The moment of silence ended with a noise that sounded like a cannon firing. Bob's body convulsed forward violently. He yelled out the loudest sneeze of his life, "Achoo." It was not a polite, quiet sneeze. It was the kind of sneeze that shakes your entire body and hurts your ribs. Because Bob had a terrible cold, this sneeze was wet and heavy. A cloud of microscopic droplets, mucus, and saliva burst from his nose and mouth. It sprayed out into the sunlight like a fine mist. Bob had accidentally turned himself into a biological spray bottle. The force of the sneeze nearly knocked him over the edge of the roof, but he grabbed the metal railing just in time to steady himself. He blinked his eyes, feeling dazed and dizzy from the effort. Gravity immediately took control of the situation. The cloud of fluid did not disappear into the wind. Instead, it formed a heavy, invisible shower that fell straight down toward the park. It moved quickly through the air. Directly below, the Vex Supreme Commander was still looking up with his mouth slightly open in confusion. He was trying to identify the strange human on the roof. He did not see the danger coming. The droplets were too small to be seen clearly by the naked eye until it was too late. The commander stood there, proud and unprotected without his helmet, waiting for an answer to his dominance. Instead, he received a face full of the human cold virus. The impact was silent but devastating. The mist landed directly on the commander's pale, smooth face. It covered his eyes, his nose, and his open mouth. It splashed onto his shiny white armor, leaving small, wet spots on the perfect metal. To a human, this would just be gross and annoying. To the Vex, who had never touched a germ in thousands of years, it was a catastrophe. The commander blinked in shock. He felt the cold, wet sensation on his skin. He reached up with a trembling hand and touched his face. He looked at the fluid on his glove. His eyes went wide with pure horror. It was the first time in his life he had touched something unclean. Up on the roof, Bob stood up straight. He sniffled loudly. He looked down and saw the alien leader staring at him. Bob felt incredibly embarrassed. He did not know that he had just launched a biological attack. He just felt rude for sneezing on a stranger. He leaned over the railing and waved his hand awkwardly. "Sorry," Bob shouted down to the terrifying aliens. "I have a bad cold. It just came out." His voice echoed in the silent park. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a crumpled, dirty tissue, and blew his nose loudly again. The sound was like a trumpet in a library. Suddenly, the quiet scene turned into chaos. The commander's suit began to scream. A bright red light started flashing on his chest plate. A robotic voice from his armor announced loudly, "Warning! Warning! Unknown pathogen detected. Shield breached." The other Vex soldiers panicked. They pointed their advanced scanners at their leader. The devices beeped frantically. The screens showed millions of red dots covering the commander. They were not detecting a bomb or a laser. They were detecting the rhinovirus, the common cold. To the aliens, Bob was not a mechanic, he was a walking biological weapon factory, and he had just fired the first shot directly into their leader's face. The reaction to the sneeze was instant and terrifying to watch. The Vex Supreme Commander did not just wipe his face. He grabbed his throat as if he were being choked by an invisible hand. His perfect, pale skin began to change color rapidly. It turned from white to a sickly shade of purple in seconds. For a human, a cold virus takes days to show symptoms. But the Vex had lived in sterile bubbles for thousands of years. They had absolutely no immune system. To the commander's body, the common cold was not just a sickness, it was like drinking acid. He fell to his knees on the grass, gasping for air. His body shook violently as his system went into total shock. He pointed a trembling finger up at the roof and screamed, "Poison! The native is made of poison." The Vex soldiers stared at their fallen leader in horror. They checked their wrist scanners and saw the data. The screens showed millions of tiny biological enemies attacking the commander's cells. To them, this was not a simple illness. It looked like a biological weapon designed to melt them from the inside. "Level 10 hazard," one soldier shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "The atmosphere is full of active agents. We are compromised." The soldiers looked up at Bob. They no longer saw a weak, soft human mechanic. In their eyes, Bob had transformed into a terrifying monster. They saw him as a biological bomb that was leaking death into the air. They backed away from the commander, afraid to touch him, terrified that the human curse would jump to them. Up on the roof, Bob had no idea what was happening. He just saw the alien fall down. He thought perhaps the commander had slipped on the wet grass. Bob felt responsible and a little guilty. He wiped his nose on his sleeve again and leaned over the railing to check on the situation. "Hey!" Bob shouted down, his voice thick with congestion. "Are you okay? Do you need a doctor? I have some aspirin in my truck." When Bob leaned over, the sunlight hit his face, and he squinted. His nose twitched again. The dust from the vent was still swirling around him. He took a deep breath, preparing for another sneeze. The Vex soldiers saw Bob take that deep breath. They saw his chest expand. They saw his eyes close. Panic exploded among the ranks. "He is reloading," a soldier screamed hysterically. "He is charging another attack. Run for your lives." The discipline of the alien army shattered completely. They did not care about conquering Earth anymore. They only wanted to get away from the infected human. They dropped their expensive plasma rifles on the ground because the weapons were heavy and slowed them down. They turned around and sprinted toward their ship. Bob sneezed again, a double sneeze this time. "Osichoo! Osichoo!" The sound echoed across the park like a thunderclap. The aliens screamed as if they were being shot at. They tripped over each other in a desperate stampede to get up the white ramp. Two soldiers grabbed the commander by his feet and dragged him across the grass, pulling him into the safety of the ship. The commander was still babbling about micro-monsters as he disappeared inside. The humans on the street watched in stunned silence. They saw the most advanced army in the galaxy running away in terror, defeated not by nukes or tanks, but by a mechanic who just couldn't stop sneezing. The massive ramp of the alien ship hissed shut faster than a blinking eye. The engines roared to life, but this time there was no grace or silence. The ship blasted off with a violent shake, crushing the beautiful park grass underneath it. It shot straight up into the sky, breaking the sound barrier with a loud boom that shattered windows in the nearby buildings. The Vex were in such a hurry to escape the infected planet that they didn't even care about flight safety. Within seconds, the silver giant was just a tiny sparkle in the upper atmosphere. They were running away to the edge of the galaxy, desperate to find a hospital and a decontamination shower. Earth was left alone once again, safe under the blue sky. Before the Vex disappeared completely, they left a final message. A small, black metal object dropped from the ship and floated in orbit around the Earth. It began broadcasting a warning signal to every other alien species in the universe. The message was simple and terrifying to anyone who heard it. It said, "Do not approach Sector 7. The inhabitants are biological weapons. They spray acid from their faces. The planet is a Class 5 toxic death world." The Vex had marked Earth as the most dangerous place in the galaxy. They believed that humans had mastered the art of biological warfare, when in reality, humans just forgot to wash their hands sometimes. Down on the ground, the silence slowly turned into confusion, and then into joy. The people in the park looked at the empty sky. They looked at the abandoned alien guns on the grass. Then, they all turned their heads toward the roof of the building. The police officers lowered their weapons and started clapping. The cheering spread through the crowd like a wave. People hugged each other and pointed up at the mechanic. They realized that the mighty invasion had been stopped not by nuclear missiles or brave soldiers, but by a runny nose. The news cameras zoomed in on the roof, broadcasting Bob's face to the entire world. Bob, however, was terrified. He did not know he was a hero. He watched the ship leave and thought he had ruined everything. He thought he had offended the space guests and caused an intergalactic diplomatic incident. He quickly packed his wrench and screwdriver into his tool belt. He grabbed his box of tissues and tried to sneak toward the roof access door. He wanted to go home, take some medicine, and hide under his blanket. But before he could open the door, a military helicopter rose up from the other side of the building. The wind from the blades made his hair messy, and he sneezed one last time into his sleeve. The helicopter landed on the roof, and heavily armed soldiers jumped out. But they were not wearing combat gear. They were wearing bright yellow hazmat suits with thick glass helmets. They approached Bob carefully, as if he were a ticking bomb. A general stepped forward, holding a megaphone. Bob raised his hands in surrender, shaking. "I'm sorry." Bob yelled over the noise of the helicopter. "I didn't mean to sneeze on the space guy." The general lowered the megaphone and gave Bob a thumbs up through the thick glass. "Son," the general said, his voice crackling through a speaker, "you just saved the human race. You are the most dangerous man alive." Later that evening, the world celebrated. There were fireworks and parties in every city. Bob was given a medal for bravery, though the president handed it to him using a pair of long metal tongs just to be safe. Scientists declared that humanity's greatest strength was not its intelligence or its strength, but its filth. The universe was full of clean, perfect, and weak aliens, and Earth was the only place dirty enough to survive. Bob went home, made a hot cup of tea, and turned on the TV. He saw his own face on the news with the headline, "The sneeze heard around the world." He smiled, blew his nose one more time, and finally went to sleep, the accidental guardian of the galaxy.